In this episode, we're going to equip you to understand which tools you should be using for design and for research. We're going to have a special guest on, Roger Wong, who had a widely published article discussing a breakdown he had on different AI coding tools that he uses in his design practice. And he's also going to touch on some of the recent news from Figma and their config.
So in the last episode, we talked a little bit about how we can't over rely on some of these tools, but let's talk about how we can rely on them. Let's talk about how we can get the best use out of them.
So let's go back to my experience last week that was frustrating. I'm working on a strategy project and I started using Claude Pro and ChatGPT Pro for a very similar task. And I was running into an issue where there was an insane amount of hallucinating happening where none of the results were trustworthy. This is not that surprising. But then we moved up to some deep research tools. We used the ChatGPT deep research as well as the new Manus AI tool. What was fascinating about these tools is they are unbelievably much more comprehensive in what they do. They give you much more visibility in what's happening, and they spend a lot more time doing the tasks that you've asked them to do. But, and this is where the continued but keeps coming in, is ChatGPT, well, it still does hallucinate, and it's important nonetheless to still go back and verify what you're doing. For anyone who is doing knowledge work, if you go out and just push out a deliverable that was created by any of these tools, doesn't matter if you're paying $200 a month or $10 million a month, you need to go verify it. That's just the current state of these tools. Now, when we went to Manus, the very same query, I ended up burning every single credit I had for the trial. We're talking about 1,000 credits, and then I got another 1,000 credits, and the same request basically maxed it all out. So ultimately, what it means is that these deep research tasks, the ones that researchers and strategists might take for granted, are actually much more complex than these systems perhaps are designed for right now.
I think there's some important things to consider. I think one is that even though everything is being called deep research right now, they're not all made the same. So for example, I was recently working on just pulling some insights to be able to use as reference, as an example in a deck that I was working on. And I decided to give Perplexity's deep research product a try. And the insights that it provided were amazing. They were astounding. And when I tried to look at the sources, they were all made up. They sounded great. It made me look really good as an example, but I could not verify them, right? Some of these products are still not there yet. When we get into something like Manus and deep research for ChatGPT, that's where we're starting to see, they seem much more sandboxed when you're working in these higher cost environments. And so ChatGPT's deep research, I would say for a researcher's lens, is still the best one. It seems to be really improving almost every week, where now we're at a point where I can pull a query and it will give me, for the most part, references and sources where it will even highlight where in that website or that PDF that it's finding that information from. So it's really good and able to do that. One of the problems that I still have, though, is that we are constantly still having to work within that chat box, that query box. And so in order to then make changes to the outputs that it's providing, it's still a little bit fumbly. So you're having to go through and kind of query it or ask questions the way that you would, let's say, if you were asking a freelancer who had done the research or conducted it, and have a dialogue with it still and kind of ask and play around with it. But I definitely think that ChatGPT's enterprise level or pro level deep research is really promising for someone who needs to be able to get insights quickly that they can then start to work with and play around with and make more refined themselves.
I want to flag, I've been reading a bunch of articles since we did this experiment. And it sounds like the Gemini product has some capabilities that are supposed to be really rich in terms of how it can do comparisons, scoring, and rankings and such. So I'd encourage anyone who is interested in deep research tools to explore that. But then the other side, and this goes as a bit of a preview of the conversation with Roger that's going to be here in a second, is that basically the interface and the controls often dictate the type of experience you have. So when we're talking about knowledge work, and knowledge work here can be defined as searching for examples, looking for inspiration, looking for data, data analysis, research. It's a really wide spectrum. You might want a different format than a chat interface. Now, both ChatGPT and Claude have launched these canvases and these artifact tools to make it easier to go back and reconnect with your output. But then there are also competing platforms like Cove. It is, imagine Miro, where then you can prompt in cards. But more than that, you can also ask it to generate AI functions within the interface of a whiteboard. So you could have basically 8 generations of the same prompt next to one another, and then you can do comparisons across them. You could import in a variety of different reports or different references and ask it to do comparisons or pull from that. Now, again, going forward and thinking about this conversation with Roger, where he's examining different design tools, that was one of his big findings, is that designers don't want to be constrained in a tech-based interface. And in many respects, it feels like the design tools are still not necessarily super aligned to what the designer needs. So there's probably going to be a bit of a steep learning curve for designers as these tools evolve to meet your needs.
I also wonder, because right now everything is very prompt based. And even when you're using these tools that are creating artifacts, Cove is one of the unique ones that allows you to pull those artifacts apart and be able to interact with each one separately. So you can then go in and say, hey, actually, I just want to change this little bit of this piece, or I only want to query on this thing. Or, let's say you've gone ahead 3 or 4 steps and you want to go back to something you were before. It's one of the few that allows you to do that in a really intuitive way. It'll be interesting to see, especially when we think about these design tools, where you're kind of having to prompt it in a way that is really different than how people actually think about using these tools. And if you want to be able to change just one little piece of it, you have to go and hope and pray that it understands the prompt about just that one little piece rather than changing everything.
You brought up freelancers earlier, and I actually think it's very aligned to that. Imagine you have a freelancer who is not the most reliable, but they have some skills of some form. If you give them a very detailed brief with very clear instructions and very clear schedule of reviewing what they've done, then you'll have very successful results. The problem, just like with freelancers, is if they send you a document, you need a way to annotate what they've done, and you need an easy way for them to interpret the context of what your request is. These tools are very much at that nascent stage. So realistically, we can't really recommend any of them for very complex tasks, except if they're very clearly defined, where the outcomes are highly specified, and where you are in a position to very clearly articulate what the revisions need to be post-delivery.
It's really important, though, that we also talk about some of the things that we've learned about how to be more successful in some of these spaces. And if we want to keep playing on this idea of the freelancer and engaging with the freelancer, one of the core things is, yes, you have to brief them really tightly, but you also need to provide them with reference of like what that brand tone and past work has been, but you also need to give them a reference of what success looks like. Like, what is it that you're actually expecting to receive at the end of it, or what are some frames around it? And these tools are sort of the same thing. So I found that I become much more successful in the output that I get, the more specifically I articulate what I expect to receive in the end. And even if it's something as simple as like, I want this to be more concise, I will get a much stronger output if I say more concise, but still holds true to these things and saying what my expectations are and saying, concise to be 30% shorter. So the more that I provide details of what I expect or give reference of, similar to this and provide a reference of what it is that I'm looking for, the more effective it will be. So that's number one. I think number two, especially when we're talking about design and especially around research, is we often forget that even if you're uploading documents and references, these tools are still, for the most part, going to try and pull anything and everything within their training. And so when we want it to only reference things that we're providing, let's say, for example, if you're uploading 15 user interviews, and I only want to look at what do these 15 user interviews tell me, you need to be explicit to say only reference these documents that I'm providing. Are there any other things you've learned that could make people better at using these tools? Anything that stands out to you as a hack?
Well, it's garbage in, garbage out. So I think you make sure that there's very structured information going in. So append a brief if you can. Append a data set in a very structured table where the labels are clear, where the data is coherent, avoid having extra sheets in there. If you have specific references that need to be included in terms of what your output or what the search is, be explicit about those. Be explicit about what needs to be verified or not. And on the verification side of things, make sure to constantly have it reflect on itself. Verify that all these sources are accurate. Make sure that all these URLs lead to active pages. Verify that what is listed here can be pulled directly from something that's quoted in a separate doc. But then the other side of it, and this is one of those funny human qualities, is you can talk to the AI in a way that you wouldn't talk to a person. And you can actually tell it, this will not work for this audience. This audience needs it to be funnier. This audience needs it to be more fantastical. I need this to be more aggressive in this component. So you can be very direct in your language and avoid long-winded things. Now, one of the other areas that's coming out in terms of the whole vibe coding, vibe everything craze is that you need to have version control on your prompts, because quite often the tools are generating things that you're not aware of. You might be focused on a change that's making in section A, but meanwhile in section K, totally rewritten something. And you may not notice that until 3 more versions down the line. So you need version control, not only in being able to go back to that version, but also in terms of understanding what the prompt was so that you could rewrite it to be more specific and hypervigilant to outputs. But again, I really think that a critical piece is constantly checking in with the tool and solution and restating the rules, the guidelines, and the specifications that were mission critical for it. Because sometimes it forgets and it meanders and it dissociates from what the original intent of the request was.
All right, let's go over to Roger Wong and chat about his exploration of these vibe coding tools.
Hey, Roger, designers are overwhelmed with so many new tools. You used to learn one tool and you'd use it for 5 years, and then there might be change and your craft would evolve incrementally. How would you describe what's happening now in the world of design?
It's a fun time to be alive. There's definitely an explosion of tools that's happened in the last 12 months. I think playing with these tools gives you a sense of possibility, but also overwhelm at the same time because there are so many of them. There's also frustration.
Over the last 10 years, we've gone through this process of refining the design tools. It was giving designers more and more control. And it feels like right now we've stripped control away, and instead we've added sparkles on top, and no one knows what exactly the sparkles do. What does it feel like to be a designer working?
It could be that we're in an existential crisis. It feels like it could be that AI seems like it's knocking on our doors and saying, hey, we could be taking your jobs away. Because it's taken a lot of our expertise and thrown it into this magic box that anyone can type in and get something out. But I also believe that it's a chance for us to level up our game and bring the real value that we bring, which is less, in my mind, less about pixel pushing and much more about focusing on solving real user problems. You know, I don't mind letting the AI push pixels for me. I instead want to talk to users and really understand their problem and direct the AI to help solve it, if that makes sense.
Of course, that sounds wonderful. You can focus on the craft. You went on this journey of evaluating these, I don't even know if you call them no code tool anymore, because that infers still you can track with the code. It falls in this vibe category. What would you consider this category of tools that involve coding, but involve design and are text or chat-based interface?
I've been calling them prompt to code tools. I feel like that's descriptive. I personally hate the word vibe coding or that phrase, or even vibe design.
It infers very unspecific, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. As professional designers and makers, we want to be involved in the crafting.
Then why did you go down this journey of evaluating these tools? What was the roadblock that you encountered that made you need to answer the question of which is the right tool for the right problem?
The tools have been exploding. A lot of them do the same thing, which is put in the prompt and then you get actual working code and prototypes that you can play with. for professional designers, that's not enough control, because I want to be able to move things up and down by the pixel. I want to size things. And to have to articulate that into a prompt every single time, wait for the LLM to think, and then show me something. And it could be right or it could be wrong. It's not as direct as I would want as a designer, right?
So I see that you have a scoring matrix that you use to evaluate these tools. Can you tell us a bit about how you developed that matrix and how you decided which tools to evaluate?
I wanted to judge these tools on kind of a level playing field. Part of it is definitely the quality of the output, but that's not the whole thing, because the intent is, okay, get something and then as a designer, go and mess with it, tweak it, make it your own, right? So I didn't necessarily need that to be the highest thing. I felt like ease of use was definitely going to be important, especially from a design angle. Control is something I really wanted. So how do I, as a designer, control the output or control what was generated? I also feel like a lot of these tools are great for 0 to 1 ideation or projects. So if you're just starting a website from scratch or a new app from scratch, they're great. But I bet a lot of the market is actually in modifying existing apps or websites and having to fit into an established design system. So that was another criteria. Speed is definitely of one. And then I just had like a random category of like, okay, if I encounter any problems or delight, I can add or subtract more points that way.
And to anyone listening, they can find an article about the set of reviews on your website, right? rogerwong.me. And then it looks like you've also published a video on YouTube. So it's great.
That's correct.
Let's get into it. Which is the product that you'd say the most disappointed you? What did it do that you frustrated, perhaps?
I think the product that most frustrated me is Replit. It is at the bottom of my list. And a lot of it is because, and this is very typical of LLMs, it just gets confused and then wrapped up into its own circle of confusion. It just took a long time and it didn't work at the very end of the day. I believe it was over 20 minutes where it was trying to create this very basic shopping cart flow, right? So if you think about a shopping cart flow, it should be the shopping cart itself, payment and shipping combined, and then a confirmation screen. So 3 to 4 screens. It ended up generating nothing at the end. It literally just errored out, even after a lot of coaxing.
So what does it say about the AI product industry when Replit was like a darling a year ago, getting press everywhere, getting featured everywhere? Their CEO was like a bit of a rock star. And now they have a dozen competitors. How are we as designers and creatives supposed to have any sense of certainty about what we're supposed to work with if the field is changing so fast?
I don't know. It is really, really difficult. I don't think I have a great answer other than Figma is a good bet, right? Because they're big and they have a lot of capital. They have a lot of employees thinking about these problems. But I would also consider companies and startups that really care about us as an audience and as a user base. I think a lot of these other companies are more horizontal, more general, right? So Replit, Bolt, Lovable, et cetera, they're more after the product management crowd, maybe designer, but I doubt it. So they're going for a much wider audience. And Subframe, they are small. I've talked to their CEO, but they care about design. And the tool that they're building is definitely bespoke to our use cases and giving us the control that we want.
Okay. So without further ado, let's go the rankings.
I think the best, according to the testing that I did, the rubric that I had, is Subframe. And I think it is because it gives us the AI capability in the beginning. There's a delightful interaction that they came up with. If you've ever used Midjourney before, you type in a prompt and then like 4 tiles come into focus kind of slowly after, a minute or two, right? They did the same thing with their generating variations of the same screen. And then you can click into it and look at them, and they're not flat images. They're actually like completely built screens. And then you can choose one and then make that into a page. So there's a little delight and care that they have there in their product. And then once it's a page, you can click on things and have an inspect panel on the right, just like Figma, layers on the left, and move things around, change things, as opposed to going back to the AI and trying to type in the words to make the changes that you want. So I think it gives that balance of AI ideation and control because I'm a professional designer.
So who would be number 2 and number 3 on your list?
OnLook and then V0. OnLook, I think, is an interesting approach. They're taking an interesting approach. It's a self-contained app. They are running the actual code inside like a little tiny frame after you've put in your AI prompt. It gets a little bit technical, but I've been using Cursor for a while. And so I've been learning what developers go through in terms of like setting up a coding environment and stuff, right? So I think OnLook kind of abstracts a lot of that away and runs the code inside the frame there. But again, in my later testing, I still ran into issues of the code not quite working. And so it gets a little higher of a score because it can theoretically work with your code base, but it's something to take a look at, but I would definitely watch out to see if the AI is actually working right. Number 3 is V0. It's one of the earlier ones, but I do like that it's fast and it's great for just doing quick prototyping.
Okay. So in the middle of the pack, you had Tempo, Polymet, and Lovable. What made them not perform so good?
I think for Tempo, I like the approach that they're taking. They're almost taking the steps that we go through as designers, right? Like crafting a product brief from the prompt and then creating a user flow, then wireframes, and then filling in the wireframes with actual design. The reason it got a lower score is because it promises direct manipulation. Like I can click into a layer and either move things around or change some values. But after playing with it a number of times, I still wasn't able to do that for some reason. And I reached out to their support, but they never really got back to me. So I don't quite know why it's not working the way it's supposed to. And that's not even the AI. It's an actual function of their software. Polymet is also another interesting one, but there's no direct design control. Prompt to code, it generates all the different components and assembles them into pages, which visually is super cool. But then they don't offer the tools for a designer to go in and directly manipulate. You have to go back, click on an element, make a change via prompting, or do a general prompt and change the entire page at once. Lovable is similar. I reevaluated them because I did the initial evaluation a couple of weeks ago, and then they came out with a V2 version, so I wanted to check that out. I think results were relatively the same. It might have been a little bit slower, but it's the same thing, right? Prompt to code, no design manipulation that I was looking for in my search.
So when I'm looking at your scores, nothing scored into the 80s. Everything was generally in the middle of the band. As a designer, what would you say the core deficiency is that's really hampering any of these from scoring highly in your matrix?
I think it comes down to 2 things. The first one is direct design control, as we talked about. A lot of these in the middle of the pack don't have that. I would say that, Tempo promises it, OnLook promises it, Subframe does it. And then the rest of them are essentially prompt and code only. There's no direct manipulation. The other factor is going to be actual design output and the actual generation. A lot of these tools use Tailwind CSS and ShadCN components. Those are, Tailwind's a styling method, but ShadCN is a very unstyled generic component library, which is good to start off with. Just because of that, it's not going to give you super cool looking designs. It'll give you the structure, but if part of the criteria is visual design, it's never going to get up there until they start styling those components in a better way.
So after having conducted this evaluation, where do you sit? Do you sit in a place where you would recommend other designers to hold and wait to see what comes out? Or are there some of these tools you would recommend for very specific use cases?
Before I went through this exercise, my team and I did look at Lovable and V0. And my team started using both V0, Lovable, but also Claude and ChatGPT to start their ideation processes. One of the designers on my team, she was working on a relatively complicated like budget forecasting calculator screen. And she used, I think it was both Claude and probably V0 to come up with a couple of prototypes. And using these tools to give some ideas of how these interactions can work, it's a jumping off point. So I would not recommend saying, okay, let's use V0 and only use that for production, but I would use it for ideation to get other ideas that you may not have thought of or seen in a competitive audit. For doing actual design, I think subframe is something to definitely look at because it gives us that control that we're looking for. I'm also very excited to start playing with the new stuff that Figma has come out this week. It's not completely rolled out yet. Figma Make, I checked right before our interview today, and I still don't have access to it. It'll be interesting to see how that changes the game or gives us more stuff to play with and give us even more ideas. But ultimately, like I said, what I'm looking for my team is how can we close that design to code gap while leveraging AI? And does Figma Make solve that issue? I don't know yet. We'll see.
But overall, it sounds like you're still a buyer waiting for the right solution, that none of these really hit the mark properly. So if we were to give advice to Figma, obviously the roadmap is already set, but none of us are privy to it. What do they need to do to keep the audience that they've spent the last 5-10 years building?
I really do think it's closing the gap on the last mile being the design to code handoff and really collapsing that. They have dev mode. It doesn't really address the issue because developers still have to go in and then they're looking at the components and the Figma generated code. But when you're working in a platform on an app or even an established website, you're not going to take that code straight from Figma. You're going to go back into your code base and use what you have. That translation is a gap that I think Figma is well positioned to close if they want to do it. We have needs now and today. And am I willing to wait another year for them to close that gap? I don't know. I don't think so. I think in the future, I can see a world where we do a lot of the ideation and initial design in Figma, but then go into a tool like Subframe to maybe create the final screen that we can then like literally tell our front-end developers, here's the layout, here are the components, use this because it's using code from our own GitHub repository.
So let's imagine a couple of these potential futures. Obviously, one of them is that Figma retains control and dominance over the design craft. Another one is perhaps that the developers dictate a lot more of that process. If we were to go to that scenario where developers are controlling more of that workflow, what would be the downsides for designers? And what do you think that we'd have to build into and accommodate for that perhaps we're not comfortable with right now?
Yeah, if it's up to developers alone, my sense is that it's always going to be, okay, use the components that we have, don't invent anything new. Everything's incredibly well structured. I think part of what we do as designers is we're always open to the possibility of something new and maybe playful. And that's very hard to do once a design system has been established and you're working within a very stringent structure, right? And what an open canvas like Figma allows us to do is to actually do that playing. And then it's translating those ideas into something that's codable. So if developers have their way, there's probably a little bit less of that play.
And what new skill set would designers have to learn to be able to exist in this rapidly changing ecosystem if the engineering and dev side of things take more control of this?
I went on a personal journey starting late last year of trying to learn React, at least the concepts. And like I went through a quick Next.js tutorial and started some coding and definitely using Cursor helped. I feel like understanding how developers put together applications, not at the HTML, CSS, JavaScript level, but at the React level, which is what most of the industry uses today, or Angular your company might be using, is incredibly helpful because then you start thinking about the different components and structures the way that they do. And then you're almost talking the same language. which I think is very helpful. And then when you start looking at all these tools, will show you the code as it's being generated. You start understanding what it's doing. And then you also start understanding, okay, in Figma, what components should I be making? That's really, really helpful. And it starts closing, at least from a vocabulary standpoint, that gap between designers and developers.
And do you have any suggestions for any of the designers who are still figuring it out, how they can get started, where they should get started, what types of questions they should critically be asking of these tools and products?
Yeah, definitely take a look at some of the tools that resonate with you on my list and start playing with them. All of them have a free tier they can play with, see what resonates according to your workflow.
So it's great that Roger did that analysis and that evaluation. I honestly am a bit shocked by those results. Again, his ranking was that Subframe was number 1, OnLook was 2, V0 number 3, Tempo number 4. But again, if you look at his matrix, only 2 of the tools scored over 70 out of 100, and only 1 of the tools he could recommend. And this really shines a dark light on AI products and their maturity right now. But I suspect that this comes down to the strategy that was used by some of these products. If you go to them, almost every single one of them is actually a coding tool, except the 2 that scored the highest. OnLook, its headline is the cursor for designers. So of course, it's a no-brainer that makes a lot of sense. That's part of their use cases. But nonetheless, it didn't score that good in his matrix. The top scoring one from his list, Subframe, is directly positioned to designers. The title is Design Meet Code. It looks like a UI editor. It looks like the sort of tool that designers wish they had.
These tools are making it easier for product managers to run research programs, to turn early prototypes and ideas into code, to take code and really quick design changes. When you need to make a change to a website, you can go straight into one of these tools and stand up the code right away. We're going to really see that the roles that we currently hold are going to start merging together a lot more. And we need to find a way to be more creative in our approaches and find the right tools to allow us to be more clearly articulate about what we want to put out and publish, because it's going to become easier, but also more collaborative.
The job roles might start blending together, but to get there, we need code that's useful. And as evidenced by an experiment that was posted about the new Figma Sites tool, someone tried to just get the code generated for a button, simple red button. But when you look at the inspector, the code's really inefficient, artifacts all over the place. So it feels like Roger's goal of a tool that handles the last mile of getting design to a point where it's dev ready, or at least dev applicable, is not there yet. Figma still has some things to work out, but nonetheless, you're right. Some of these predictions are going to come to play. The roles are going to shift. Product managers are going to be more empowered, but equally so, designers and writers might also as well.
Well, I'm excited to continue to play around with more tools and to be able to bring some of that information to everyone who's listening.
It's obvious from Figma's release that everybody is trying to be the dominant platform, but we'll see if we end up in a future with fragmented tools, each for very bespoke parts of the workflow, or if somebody like a Figma or an Adobe or any of these other platforms has the winner-take-all attitude to this. It's too early to tell, but the things we can take away right now are that the tools are getting increasingly stronger, more sophisticated. The hallucinations are easier to catch because they're actually including links and references. The tools can self-audit themselves. You can actually use one tool to audit another, which is a fantastic capability. And now we're better equipped to understand how to brief these tools, how to audit these tools, and how to give feedback to these tools. So in essence, the place that we are right now is that these might not be the holy grail yet in terms of exponential capabilities. But us as designers, product managers, researchers need to get much better at interpreting and communicating with them, because we need to treat them as a partner, maybe not humanize them, but ultimately we need to be serious and very focused in that types of critique and feedback.